Thank you, Wendy. I appreciate that. And thank you for everybody attending the presentation today. I genuinely appreciate the opportunity to talk through a topic that's pretty near and dear to me, something that I'm very passionate about, given my background as it relates to some of the overarching sanitary sewer issues that the state of Florida has as a whole, and then how that can affect environmental components and public health. And then we're going to tie that all kind of into SEERS compliance with the new rules and regulations that surround that, and how we need to ensure that we're performing the appropriate infrastructure inspections related to pipeline infrastructure. So with that brief introduction, we're going to go ahead and dive in. By all means, please submit questions. I'll answer them as we're going through the presentation. If it's a more robust question or requires a little bit of a longer-winded answer, I might wait until the end of the presentation or potentially reach out to you thereafter. But again, appreciate you joining with me today. So we're really going to go through 5 core topics today. The first is really understanding what pipeline infrastructure is, the different pipeline systems that exist within a building, and then the common problems most condo owners and facility owners that we see are having. We're going to talk briefly about the SEERS minimum requirements and the compliance that different agencies need to have from the architectural or the engineering standpoint, and when you're working with your local communities and your local buildings to ensure that we're meeting those standards. Then we're going to dive in and talk about condition assessment, what that really is, and how condition assessment is much more than just, say, a pipe inspection that a local plumber would be performing for you. We're going to then talk about the data that you get from that condition assessment, how you can leverage that data to make informed decisions, and then what that means for residents, occupants, and building owners. And then finally, we'll touch on the long-lasting benefits of a proper condition assessment plan as it relates to pipeline infrastructure. So very briefly about myself, I've been in the trenchless technology sector for well over 20 years. I previously worked at a company called Q's, which manufactured robotics intended for condition assessment. I've personally traveled globally, helping over 500 both local and global clients develop condition assessment programs, really on a massive scale, from Miami-Dade County, City of Tampa, and then globally across Europe and well into Asia. So our goal with any client or any organization is to always provide the most amount of data we can for informed decision-making and making clients and industry leaders understand the value of that condition assessment data. So for today, what the session purpose really is going to be on is understanding the core requirements around SEERS, that structural integrity reserve study, how it complies to the condo buildings, why it's needed, and then really give you some empowerment tools on proactive planning for pipeline infrastructure, the compliance aspect again, and then how those can correlate into long-term solutions, both in terms of rehabilitation and beyond. So for this first section here, we're going to dive into really just understanding pipeline infrastructure. So pipeline systems are largely the forgotten asset. You know, it's something that's hidden behind the walls, it's hidden under the floors. And so communities, buildings, and a lot of clients we see undertake lobby beautification projects. They'll go through a large remodel, slap a new coat of paint in an area, but really almost no consideration to the pipeline infrastructure that's residing behind those walls, under those floors, that often are the arteries and veins of any building that's really allowing those residents, that building owner, to sustain daily life, whether that's from water, sewer, and a number of other things that could be moving through the building from a pipeline infrastructure standpoint. And years of neglect often lead to catastrophic failure of piping systems. And then inevitably, that can also affect other aspects of the building from a structural integrity standpoint. It's not uncommon for us to go in, look at a building that looks incredibly well maintained. The facade is beautiful, the aesthetics are beautiful, Yet when we get into the pipeline infrastructure side, they're often the worst looking pipelines that we see. We've done this at hospitals, we've done this for the likes of NASA, and it's always the same. It's always truly the forgotten asset. And then it's not until a problem starts to exist where an organization starts to take some efforts. Oftentimes it's too late, and then it requires substantial money, substantial residential displacement, and it causes a slew of other issues that we'll get into a little bit more throughout the presentation. With that being said, some of the most common problems that are seen in neglected pipeline infrastructure, you're going to see a prevalence of more pests, an increase in pests that are happening. There's going to be the slow drainage on toilets, sinks, tubs. A lot of times you'll notice staining on ceiling tiles, staining on the wall, and then a presence of a foul odor with really no origin that's known. It's not easily identifiable. Oftentimes because there's either a crack or some other type of issue within that pipeline that's either releasing sewer gas or some other smell where it permeates through a section of the building, making it very difficult to quickly analyze and understand where that is coming from. So it is truly not always out of sight, out of mind. And what I mean by that, at least in Florida, there are a number of parking garage structures and otherwise that have piping infrastructure running throughout. And so you visibly can see the external structure of that pipeline. And so for these pipes, it's even more concerning for us that we see these pipes in communities where property managers review, residents walk by these pipes every single day. And the images shown, particularly on this slide, this is from a community that already had a full review that had been completed by a licensed engineer to showcase, you know, all the SEERS requirements that they were required to go through. And they indicated that there were minimal pipeline issues, and they effectively recommended a budget for, you know, shared standard plumbing services over the next series of years. We were called because of an active problem in that particular community, and what we found was far from minimal pipeline issues. And come to find out, in that particular assessment and what we've learned since and many others, the assessments are oftentimes a visual assessment on the exterior of a pipe or using a flashlight, looking into some key critical areas within the building, but there's not a lot of internal pipeline assessment happening. In this particular case, they need well over $1 million of pipe rehabilitation. It would cost them probably in the neighborhood of $4 to $5 million if they were to do a traditional replacement. We were going to be able to do a trenchless pathway, but what's interesting is this is a building that bills itself as a luxury building. It's a 20-story building in South Florida. And then almost a year later, no action has been taken by that building. The pipes exist in the same way where there's active sewage leaks, and it puts us in an awkward position as a contractor. And there's a reason that a lot of contractors are stepping away from and not wanting to work with condo buildings because of our legal obligations to report to the DEP, and also wanting to make sure that we're working with great partners in engineering and architectural firms to provide the best value to that end client. So once we get that baseline understanding of pipeline infrastructure within a building, we can then start to talk about the general requirements around SEERS and what it really applies to. So I'm sure as all of you understand now that SEERS is kind of a baseline requirement that if you have a building that's over 3 stories or higher, it must be a licensed engineer, architect, or some other specialist to validate and verify the inspections that were completed, and that the infrastructure systems within this building that are deemed critical all require an assessment. The problem is the word assessment is oftentimes a very vague term. And so with SEERS, obviously this needs to be updated for every 10 years. Today, obviously, we're concentrating on plumbing systems, pipelining systems, and plumbing systems are one of those that is identified as an essential component that requires a significant condition assessment by the requirement within the rules of SEERS. when you look at that, it needs to make sure that it's structurally reliable, meaning the pipe itself is structurally sound, and it mitigates the potential risk of future issues, whether that be sewage, water, or anything in between. So condition assessment primarily focuses on the sanitary sewer systems, the stormwater drainage systems, potable water systems, and even in some cases, if you have natural gas systems that are going through that building. So it's important to understand how those pipeline systems can dramatically and drastically affect the overall structural integrity of a building. So the surveys that we propose to do, and the reason why it's important for condition assessment, again, as I stated earlier, is a quick visual external view of pipeline infrastructure is really doing a disservice to the client and eventually could be risking a public health situation or an environmental issue because of some of the components that could be leaking out of those pipelines. So we typically see the corrosion, the material degradation, especially in buildings that are built in the 50s and 60s. It's almost primarily all cast iron pipe. You put cast iron pipe in a coastal environment between salt water, sand, it's going to already accelerate that corrosion. And it's not atypical for us to go to a building or go to a facility, perform these inspections, and have almost no pipe left, or the cast iron is in such a brittle state, it's almost like a material of paper mache. In fact, just yesterday, we were doing a assessment at a large building on South Beach, and same thing, we inspected 55 vertical stacks in this building. Building was built in the 60s, and the pipe system pretty much does not exist. All right, so of course that also leads to those leaks and structural defects. We have a couple questions coming in, so I'm going to address those before I move to the next slide here. So the first question is, what is the estimated longevity of a sanitary sewer system in a Florida high-rise residence? So that is going to vary whether you're in a coastal community or an inland community, the age, but generally speaking, cast iron starts to degrade in about 30 to 40 years. So if you're inside of a building or near a building that has a pipeline system, or rather was built 30 to 40 years ago, there is high probability that it is mostly cast iron pipe. It is probably in that brittle state. So that's generally the life expectancy of a cast iron pipe system. If you get into certain other materials in newer buildings like PVC, they do have a much longer life. They have different failure points within those systems. But again, generally speaking, most sewer systems in a high rise are going to be rated between 30 to 40 years. Nowadays, if it's a newer building, that can get to be 50 years plus. So great question though. So when we start to look at the requirements related to the plumbing systems for SEERs, it is supposed to be a true internal visual assessment. So we're supposed to be scoping the inside of those pipes by use of a variety of technologies. So that means you need to understand the current condition of that pipeline, the structural reliability of that pipeline, and then the potential risk of failure within that pipeline asset. And it's important to notate too, that you could be in a building where the south side of the building has noticeable more degradation than the north side. So it's important that when an assessment is done, it is truly done at a 100% level of that building, going into every sanitary sewer stack, every potential piece of pipe that is accessible. So when we look at the inspection and reporting characteristics, the study again must include a thorough visual technological inspection of that plumbing infrastructure, identifying the critical issues that we already discussed. And then from that inspection, really what should be documented in a detailed report should include a pipe score or a pipe severity score, the estimated remaining life, and then the recommendations for that repair or replacement, or if it has a long life left, to pretty much give them a game plan for the future. So a couple more questions here, so I'm going to address those before I move to the next slide. Question is there a benefit to still using cast iron piping in new construction? Have recently performed a project where it was spec'd as cast iron by the mechanical engineer. That's a great question. There are still a lot of industry segments that do require cast iron piping. A lot of that has to do with the fire ratings on cast iron versus a plastic pipe. What a lot of places are doing, if it is specified that you need to reinstall cast iron, the recommendation from us and within the industry in general is to do what is called a pre-coated or pre-epoxied piece of cast iron pipe, where the internal lining of that pipe has already been covered or impregnated with a epoxy resin that immediately increases the life. And then you, of course, immediately reduce the chance of degradation on that particular asset. But again, great question. Especially in the medical world, you're going to see a lot of metallic pipes still being used because of the conveyance of the different liquids. But yes, cast iron is still frequently spec'd throughout the industry. Great questions, though. So when we get into those implications of non-compliance, with some of the SEERS rules and regulations that are in place, there are some significant implications here. So it can lead to obviously both legal and financial repercussions for non-compliance. And this isn't about necessarily the plumbing system per se, but this is more about just SEERS in general. So it could be considered a breach of fiduciary duty, where you have a board member or somebody else as an officer that is not doing the appropriate due diligence, and they're not taking it seriously to resolve those issues. And I think I'm going to pause there just so everybody understands that a licensed contractor in the state of Florida legally has an obligation that if we see leaky sanitary sewer or other environmental concerns, we do have an obligation to report that to the state watch office and have that listed as a public pollution notice. It's a little bit of an odd place for a contractor to go into a building and do that. So we always try to work hand in hand. But I can tell you from these non-compliance perspectives, we've been into a number of buildings where I would definitely not want to be a resident. I would definitely not even want to be close to that building because of the state. So for us, it is interesting to see these non-compliance penalties being applied. We think they are essential, but it could also eventually present insurance and financing challenges. By far in the state of Florida, the biggest insurance claim is related to water damage. And a lot of that is dirty water damage, where you have a backed up sewage system, it flooded an entire first floor, or you had a pipe bust on the 19th floor, and then you have a residual downfall of whatever liquids expelled at that location. So it can definitely present insurance consequences. It obviously can present property value decline if you have this beautiful building, but yet you have a really antiquated old plumbing system that doesn't even allow you to operate within the modern conveniences of life. You have issues flushing your toilet, you have issues draining your tub. All of those things should not be happening. So all of those things correlate back to non-compliance. And then of course it leads to mandatory seller disclosures as well. When you complete that SEERS, you have to let people know what your findings are. So compliance and adherence to SEERS is the critical next step to ensure that these condo buildings specifically do have the appropriate reserve funds established. They have the opportunity to set up appropriate pathways, because time and time again, we go into communities, we go into locations where it is a dire situation. And I know I keep providing these reference points, but I think it's important to correlate. Another building in South Florida over a year ago, there was a 10-foot void under the parking garage structure, directly correlated to sanitary sewer spilling out, washing away the soil. Major structural issue. To this day, it still has not been resolved. We have an obligation for the residents of that building. We have an obligation for just overall integrity of how we operate, to ensure that the community members and the general public are aware of the potential risk factor at that building. We don't like to talk much about, Surfside and things that happen there, but we also want to make sure that we're doing everything in our power to ensure it does not happen again. And some of that does tie back to the effects of plumbing systems and the consequences of not addressing the downfall of water and sewage that eventually could cause that structural degradation. So as we start to move into our next section here, we're going to move into section 3. which is talking about the actual condition assessment process. So as I talked about earlier, condition assessment is definitely not a simple visual review of any pipeline asset. Any plumber on the planet is going to have a push camera, just like the video you see there. They're able to push through. In this case, it's a cast iron vertical stack where you can see that there's a heavy buildup of tuberculation on the sidewalls. So any plumber can take a push camera, push through, and give you a general understanding of what that pipe looks like. But the actual condition assessment process goes one step beyond a standard inspection, and that's where you're going to start to truly evaluate the structural integrity and the operational efficiency of that pipeline. So it's really, think about going to the doctor and doing a physical. So that's more of what the condition assessment is for the pipeline infrastructure. It's to give you a general health of your pipeline infrastructure so that you can take the necessary proactive steps before you do find yourself in a situation where you have issues, or if you do discover that you have an issue, you can immediately address that as opposed to it accelerating and becoming a potential catastrophic issue down the line. So condition assessment historically has proven time and time again to save people time, money, headaches, and everything in between. So on a much larger scale from a Sears component, if you look at pipeline assessment and how it's been utilized at a large scale, BP, for example, regular condition assessments of oil pipelines throughout Alaska and beyond, they identified basically what was a catastrophic issue, and it saved multi-billions of dollars in environmental damage that could have happened if they were not performing those condition assessments. Same thing for almost every local municipality. San Francisco is one that I pulled out here going back to 2012. They were able to identify corroded pipes that would have likely led to sinkholes and other issues. And I recognize both of those examples are more on a global scale, if you will. But when we really start to drill into local communities, whether it's the city of Orlando, Jacksonville Electric Authority, Miami-Dade County, all of them from a city municipal standpoint perform these condition assessments in alignment with EPA guidelines for capacity management. And it's important that private buildings that have a responsibility to the residents embrace this same approach, because I surely would not want to own, especially in the state of real estate right now, I would not want to own a multi-million-dollar beachside condo where I can't flush the toilet, I can't use the tub, or each time I do, it's a risk on whether it's going to flow properly. And we truly have seen those scenarios. So the big thing that condition assessment does is risk mitigation and safety. It basically ensures that your pipelines are safe. There's not a prevalence of significant safety hazards. It helps overcome some of the environmental challenges, the legal liabilities that might be happening if you were to not perform those condition assessments. But most importantly, again, it allows for a proactive approach, because going back to the earlier start of the presentation, forgotten asset. So it's typically, we do not get called as a contractor until it's either too late or there's a catastrophic issue already in place. There's a sewage overflow, there's a water line that's busted, and that all leads to significantly more money being spent on their pipeline infrastructure than if they were to go about a proper condition assessment program. Moving into the proactive prevention, we can quickly identify structural weakness before they do lead to those catastrophic failures. By protecting those pipelines and protecting the businesses that are operating those pipelines, it allows, again, for that proactive planning to take effect, where with a condition assessment survey, any contractor that's performing this should be able to provide the end client, the architect on record, the engineer on record, a comprehensive plan, not just that, hey, your pipes are failing, but based on their severity, based on their length of time left, we can do this in a phased approach, because everyone understands condos especially do not have limited pots of money. So being able to facilitate a plan to say phase one is going to be your most critical pipelines, phase two is going to be the next most critical, and then it becomes a 5 to 7 year phased approach so that appropriate planning can come in. I can't tell you how many times where a building has a special assessment completed without any consideration to their plumbing infrastructure. Fast forward 1 year after that special assessment, they then have to do another large assessment to deal with the pipeline rehabilitation problem or just sheer outright replacement. Again, condition assessment helps solve some of those issues. It also allows for cost-effective maintenance. Now that we have a comprehensive understanding of that pipeline infrastructure within a building, that building owner can now take that data and develop an appropriate plan. Maybe they have a prevalence of high grease levels in their building because of a restaurant on site or something to that effect. You can then develop an appropriate cleaning plan, a proactive maintenance plan that allows for a lot of future pipeline issues to be mitigated on the front side without having to dig into the coffers of the building in the future because it was just outright neglect. And so this all correlates and ties back again to that data-driven decision-making. Data is power as we all know it. And the model of the past of having a local service plumber, they definitely have their place in the world, but having a local service plumber just simply always be reacting to problems in the pipeline is not a practical way in how it can correlate back again to the SEERS requirements. So having a plumber come out and only look for problems by way of inspection, that is a tool to use in an appropriate manner. But as it correlates to the SEERS requirements, as it correlates to facilitating all of the requirements, honestly, within the state of Florida for environmental compliance, that data that a condition assessment provides to you, it instantly gives you a report that you can file with the state as part of the SEERS or as part of any other assessment that has to be done as part of that building infrastructure. So there's various components that make up a condition assessment program to get you to that data point. A lot of that has to do with advanced technologies. Most contractors are going to use visual inspection, CCTV, so different various degrees of push cameras, robots that travel down the mainline sewer system, the stormwater system, and even some specialized cameras that can go into potable water and other environments. There's also a variety of new and emerging technologies for pipeline infrastructure. 3D scanning, which helps give ovality of the pipeline to make sure it's structurally sound, that it's round if it's supposed to be round. And then from there, you can correlate that into further data. So same thing for sonar. So if you have pipes within a building structure or substructure rather, that are constantly underwater, it's then also, you still need to understand the overall condition of that pipe, but you also need to understand what that debris field is like inside of that water line. So sonar profiling helps in those cases. And then finally, ground penetrating radar can also be used in conjunction with pipeline assessment to make sure that you have all the necessary components that make up an appropriate condition assessment program. So as we move into section 4, now that we've kind of walked through what pipeline infrastructure really is, the challenges that you face, the SEERS requirements, now you know what condition assessment is, let's get into the data and reports. So you're going to get a highly detailed assessment in compliance with what is called NASCO. So NASCO is the National Association of Sewer Service Companies. It is a volunteer membership, if you will, but by large and part, it is considered the authoritative standard as it relates to quantifying the data from pipeline inspections. They've been around for 30 plus years now as somewhat of a governing body around sewer service companies. Each company has to make sure that they qualify to be a member of the organization. The technicians that are actually performing the work within these communities in association with an architect, in association with an engineer, we want to make sure that these technicians hold the necessary qualifications. Anybody can take a camera, open a manhole, open a clean out, and put a camera in there, but making sure that the inspection process is facilitated in the correct way to get the right data points is essential. So making sure that they are NASCO certified is an essential next step that you can ensure whatever company you employ follows the necessary rigorous protocols that are the same requirements that are placed by the EPA, the same standards that your local communities are using at the municipal level. That way, all of this data correlates back together. So when we start talking about these condition assessment data points, the second item is understanding the actual asset mapping component. If you're working with a very large building that is going under a SEER study or any other study for that matter for future considerations, understanding the physical geolocations of these assets within a particular building is essential. So there are technologies that are available on the market. If you're working with a reputable pipeline assessment contractor, most will have these technologies already built into their camera systems or readily available, with plotting a starting and ending point so you can truly understand where that pipe snakes between the top of a structure down to the bottom floor is essential, because not every pipe is vertically straight. Not every horizontal pipe is running straight as well. There are a number of 90-degree and 45-degree bends that happen within this piping infrastructure. And so it's important to correlate and understand the potential consequence of failure. And so that's the other element here that a lot of communities don't understand, is that if I have a piece of pipe in a parking lot that is failing, the consequence of failure is still significant, but it's not nearly as significant if I have a vertical sanitary sewer stack that is openly leaking sewage over my kitchen area. That obviously, the consequence of failure, the likelihood of failure, all that needs to be able to be factored into your overall planning, and also within that budgetary management component of SEERS, that if you do find piping infrastructure that is in that severe state, obviously the line leaking sewage needs to be considered well before that line in the parking lot. So having those geolocations to understand the physical location of each individual pipe asset that's inspected, that's assessed, that is also a critical point that is collected during the condition assessment process. And then finally, we get into that pipe severity score that I mentioned. So this is a scoring algorithm that is based on a number of variables. So it's going to take in coordination the pipe size, the pipe type, the age of the pipe, whether it's a vertical pipe, a horizontal pipe, the material of the pipe, but effectively you're going to get a pipe rating, a likelihood of failure score. A likelihood of failure score is going to be on a scale of 1 to 6, 6 being the most severe. It's already in a state of failure. You need to address it immediately. 1, on the other hand, is that you have much more useful life left, where that can be then put on a condition assessment plan for possibly maybe your next SEERS study in another 10 years. So having those pipe severity scores, that's what allows the phased planning and the appropriate budgetary correlation for SEERS requirements and beyond. Also with that is the critical severity index, as we call it, which is basically a total risk assessment score. So this one is a little different than the likelihood of failure score that is on a 1 to 6 scale. The critical severity index is on a 1 to 5 scale, where 5 obviously is critical. You need to address it immediately. 4 would be severe, all the way down to 1, where the pipe is in optimal condition. This is really the general area where most clients choose to base their next steps on, because the critical severity index incorporates into that the likelihood of failure score. So this critical severity index is the ultimate basis of pipeline integrity. This ensures structural soundness. This ensures environmental compliance. And then again, all of this reporting mechanism can go back into any reports being filed with the state for their SEERS assessment, or if you're just working with a local community to develop a plan, maybe they're extending the building or building another building next to it. all of that correlates in that we need to make sure all of the existing structure is sustainable for that next stage of development. So this is actually a look of inside of a platform that we utilize for pipeline severity scoring and algorithms. So what we see here, this is a pipeline of a local hospital that was being done. So this is an assessment, and these are all of the individual observations that happen within the pipeline segment itself. So all of these codes per se are critical failure points or potential failure points inside of each individual pipeline asset. So we're able to give, again, a very comprehensive report, very comprehensive analysis. So this should all be part of that eventual SEERS assessment, because you're going to get a nice comprehensive report like this. It's going to show you the total length surveyed. It's going to show you all of the details about that pipe, what the size was, where the observations fell in alignment. You see the blinking red there. Those are going to be the most severe observations. And it shows you every potential failure point, again, within every single pipeline asset. There's no guesswork about it. This is actually a platform that a lot of contractors are starting to embrace. It's AI driven. So you're taking a computer that is then making sure it correlates back to those NASCO scores that we spoke about. And on this particular pipe segment, you see there the likelihood of failure is a 5.2 out of 6. And this is a sanitary sewer line at a local hospital underneath of a critical patient area. So we're constantly surrounded by failing pipeline infrastructure all of the time, largely due because of the whole out of sight, out of mind, forgotten asset concept. And so it's very important with all of these new rules and regulations coming down for condos specifically, that in order for the SEERS approach to work, engineers, architects, anyone else involved in the process, it's imperative that everybody is following a proper protocol. It's important for that end user, that end client, that they are receiving the right data set. And quite frankly, condition assessment from an overall cost basis to a community is extremely minimal when you consider the potential risk liability effects of not addressing it. And then in correlation to an overall assessment from an engineering or architectural firm, depending on the size of the building, it's a very minimal price point to include comprehensive pipeline inspection, pipeline assessment as part of that process. So now we finally, we have all of our data. So where do we go from here? What are the long-term benefits of that condition assessment? So ultimately, now that you have that data for your end client, for the building, you're able to report all this information to the state to either say, yes, they're fully in compliance, their infrastructure is good, we make sure that their backup reserve funds are going to be in order. All of that it essentially goes to enhanced asset longevity. If we know we have a problem today, we can fix it before it's actually broken. The environmental protection characteristics of that to ensure that you don't have sewage leak, water leaks, or other conveyance problems within a building infrastructure system. Cost efficiency, these prevent those continuous escalating problems where we've heard it time and time again where a building is calling out a service plumber, sometimes almost daily, definitely weekly, where it's a constant backup, constant backup. Well, a plumber's model, large in part, is to continue getting that service work. Ultimately, not every plumber operates like that, I want to be clear, but there are a lot of service plumbers, that's the nature of their business. They don't want a building to fix the problem. They don't want a building to ultimately resolve the problem in full. They want to ensure that they can go in with a stake, with some type of cleaning device, make the system flow again for a period of time before they're called back out and get that other service fee, that other call out fee. When you look at condition assessment companies, pipeline rehabilitation companies, our interest is aligned with a long-term sustainable solution by offering that comprehensive condition assessment, which then leads into that long-term cost efficiency as well. It also correlates to reputation management. If you have a building that has ongoing pipe problems, it can affect a number of things outside of the legal ramifications that can provide, but just overall reputation of the particular building or even the particular property management company. And then finally, obviously, all ties back to Sears compliance, the regulatory compliance aspects, making sure that we have complete data sets for every single piece of pipe within a building structure so that the Sears can be completed appropriately. The whole point of that integrity study is obviously to ensure integrity, but the ultimate is to make sure that these communities have the money to actually resolve the issues at hand. It allows for informed, data-driven decision-making. It's not something that's just scribbled on a napkin and then you have to kind of guesswork around it. It's actionable, intelligent data that you're able to make decisions on. And then ultimately, it ensures operational reliability across the entire building for that building owner, for that property manager. And I think ultimately, for everybody that's in this class and everybody that we've communicated through the industry, there's a level of important professional integrity that if you're being asked to help complete a Sears study, if you're asked to being able to complete any type of study on behalf of a client, you want to ensure when you put your stamp on there, when you put your signature on that document, that it is close to 100% accurate as humanly possible. And so by doing just an external visual assessment of pipeline infrastructure, it's not possible to ever to get to that point of professional integrity. So with that being said, that's honestly the conclusion of my presentation. I sincerely appreciate the attendance today. If anyone has any questions correlated to pipeline condition assessment, Sears compliance, or any overarching sewage-related conversation points across the state of Florida, we'd be happy to engage with each of you. We're involved at a number of events and trade shows, so by all means, feel free to reach out to me if there are any additional questions. So thank you again. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Chris. I think if anybody does have any questions, we've got a couple minutes before we go on a break. If not, oh, actually, I think somebody just put one in there. Do you see that?
I do.
Okay.
Yes, I mean there's plumbing systems can be in that fashion. So it's every building. The odd thing about this industry is every single building, especially for those that are built in the 50s, 60s, hospitals, everything in between. Plumbing systems can be in very odd locations to access sometimes. So when you talk about condition assessment and other facets of pipe rehabilitation and condition assessment, getting access to certain areas can be tough. But yeah, plumbing systems can be located in various areas for sure. Great question. Any other questions before we wrap up for the day?